Welcome, everyone. We're very glad to continue our special mini conference on housing. We are going to get a chance to hear from Rae Paul, who is with the Youth Project as a 2S LGBTQIA+ housing coordinator, and who's going to help us understand a little bit about intersectional bias in housing. We just had a chance to hear from Dr. Catherine Leviton-Reed from CBU, who gave us a bit of an overview on the housing insecurity situation here in unceded Mi'kma'ki, and we're really grateful to have a chance to hear about what that means in terms of intersectional bias with Rae, who's one of our members and just an amazing speaker. So I'm so grateful to have them here. Thank you so much, Rae.
Thanks so much, Nash, for that really lovely introduction. Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. Really happy to be here to talk a little bit about intersectional bias in housing and to represent the Youth Project. Obviously, like, this topic is something that impacts everyone. And so I'm going to take a deep look into some of the ways that intersectionality comes together to form unique experiences of trying to maintain and actually get housing. And so, great. So today I'm going to introduce the Youth Project. There's going to be a little bit of overlap with the presentation that you saw this morning. Hopefully I can explain things in maybe a different way. But a lot of the things that the earlier presentation talked about are also relevant to queer and trans youth. And so we'll be talking about defining homelessness beyond the spectrum of what we would consider to be folks who are out in the cold. And unfortunately, it's a much broader scope. I'm going to talk a little bit about neoliberalism and poverty and the ways in which those things intersect. And then I'm going to talk about some of my experiences supporting trans and queer youth, and then invite folks in for a reflection. So for folks who aren't familiar, the Youth Project is an organization that was founded in 1993. The Youth Project's mission is to make Nova Scotia a safer, healthier, and happier place for 2S LGBTQIA+ folks, which is two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, and other sexual and gender minority youth. And so some of the, I'll just kind of describe some of the images that are on my slides here. So in the top left corner, we have an icon that says Youth Project, established in 1993. And then below some of this text here, we have a couple examples of our resources that we've released in the last little while. And so furthest to the left is National Indigenous Peoples Day. We asked a few Indigenous community members, what would you want to say to someone who's younger? And so we compiled their thoughts into a resource and had some really beautiful illustrations drawn. To the right of that is a Navigating Queerness and Faith resource, which is a toolkit for supporting religious, queer, and trans folks. Just to the right of that is a Peace and Friendship Treaties and Treaty Day resource that we put together. We put out a resource every Treaty Day, and that resource specifically was targeted towards youth 12+, and understanding what our treaty responsibilities are. And then furthest to the right is a resource called You Belong Here, Conversations on Chosen Family. And so it talks a little bit about what chosen family is and how chosen families can be a really safe harbor or safe haven for a lot of queer and trans people, and trying to decentralize this idea of a nuclear family and really expand it to show all of the different ways that family and love can come together. And so those are just a few of the resources that I wanted to highlight today. If you want to check out the full versions of those resources, you can do so at youthproject.ns.ca/resources, and there's lots of great stuff on there. What I will say is that the Youth Project is also a youth-led and youth-centered organization, and so we do have a youth board. Right now, there are 14 youth on the youth board, and they inform our services, and they're a great resource for us. And it's really awesome to be able to work hand in hand with youth. So my name is Rae. I use they, them, or he, him pronouns. As Naj said, I'm the 2S LGBTQIA plus housing coordinator at the Youth Project. I'm also a social worker, and I have a youth work background. So I've been working with youth for about, I would say, eight plus years in different roles. And so I've coached hockey for a long time. I've been a facilitator of different programs, including programs where folks are coming together to talk about gender identity, but also facilitating recreation-based programs as well. And then I've done some counseling as well. And so those are some of the roles that I bring to this work. I'm also queer and transmasculine, and I'm mixed race. And I'm also from away. And so there are some things living here in Chibouctouc that I've had to come to learn. And there are also probably things that I'm also missing. And so just acknowledging the fact that I am from away. If you do want to get in contact with me, my email is here, and my slides can be shared after this webinar. And so today I'm here representing the Housing Support Program. And so this is a brand new program. My position started in August of last year. And basically I'm a housing support worker that works specifically with 2S LGBTQIA plus youth. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is a thing. But the primary demographic that I work with are youth 16 to 30 who need support navigating housing insecurity and homelessness. If you know someone who is in that range or demographic and needs support, you can feel free to email me at housing@youthproject.ns.ca. To the right here is a poster that we just had finalized for the housing support program. And so for folks who may not be able to see this, it says couch surfing on the top, and it says call on us. And it's a person wearing a mask sitting on a bus, taking a nap. And at the bottom, there are little pull tabs. So this is a physical poster. And so there are pull tabs with the QR code to the website and also the phone number and the email for the housing support program. And those will be going up all around the city. Unfortunately, right now, this program is only for folks who have ties to HRM or who are currently living in HRM. And so I'm going to start off by defining homelessness. And I think that it's a definition that depending on who you talk to, you'll get a very different response. And so today, for the sake of the presentation and looking at intersectionality, I want to kind of broaden our idea of what homelessness is. And so the official definition of homelessness, as provided by the government, is a statistical and spectrum-based category. So it categorizes folks from at risk to securely housed, and it doesn't capture the human complexity or uniqueness of people's situations and people's needs. And so homelessness specifically does not affect all groups of people the same way. And we know from the data that we've collected over a long period of time that already oppressed groups are more likely to experience homelessness, and different oppressed groups are likely to have different experiences of homelessness. And so those pieces are things that we need to take into account when we look at solutions to this housing crisis. I had the privilege of learning from Jeffrey McNeil Seymour, who is a Secwepemc Two-Spirit speaker. He passed last year, and I'm dedicating this presentation to him. But when I was learning from him, he said, before colonization, there was no homelessness. And I think that that's something that's really important when we think about situating ourselves in Mi'kma'ki, is that Indigenous homelessness, but homelessness as a problem itself, is rooted in pieces where people are not people. And so I want to think about the Indigenous definition of homelessness, and some of the Indigenous definitions of homelessness are different. But I came across this quote from Jessie Thistle, who is a Métis Cree scholar. And they said the thorough, complex, and intentional unraveling of traditional social and cultural systems known as cultural genocide has created and prolonged and continues to perpetuate Indigenous homelessness in Canada. And so when we think about this specific definition, there is this element of displacement and dispossession that has been created by settler colonialism. And today in the world, there are more displaced people than ever before. And so when we think about solutions to the housing crisis, we also have to take into account displacement as a key form of violence. A couple different pieces here in terms of just like introducing this concept of different experiences of homelessness. And so in the earlier presentation, there was some data and also some examples of homelessness and specifically for women. And so when we think about hidden homelessness, thinking about folks who are doubling up or trading sex for a place to stay, rather than accessing government-run or social services-run emergency shelters, then those folks are not counted in the same ways. And so visibility is a key piece here, and I'll touch on visibility a little bit more later on in this presentation around queer and trans folks. But there is an element where women specifically are often fleeing violence. We talked about interpersonal, intimate partner violence earlier in the first presentation, but folks are also experiencing violence while homeless. And so as we know, there's a real issue with human trafficking in this province. And so those elements are also things that we need to consider when we define homelessness. And so kind of getting to some of the meat of what I am working with and what I'm working on is specifically working with queer and trans people. And so trans people unfortunately experience high levels of hidden homelessness, and they're overrepresented in youth homelessness. Based on a book published by Away Home Canada, about 40% of youth experiencing homelessness identify as LGBTQ2S. And we also know that there are some issues that disproportionately affect queer identified youth, as highlighted in the following statistics from the book, Where Am I Going to Go? And so I'll talk a little bit more about schools specifically a little bit later, but over 80% of queer students report being aware of LGBTQ related discriminatory practices and policies in their schools. And so they don't feel that their schools are safe places for them. The majority of queer and trans and two-spirit Indigenous youth said that they were enrolled in schools. And so there's this element of coming together in a space that is unsafe, and then is also one of the places where they are going to go to school, but not all Indigenous youth are going to school. Over 38% of Indigenous youth who were queer or trans or two-spirit were unable to access mental health services when they needed to, as compared to 27% of Indigenous heterosexual cisgender youth, which are youth who identify with the sex they were assigned at birth. Queer youth were more likely, about 50%, to say that they were homeless or street involved due to their inability to get along with their parents, as compared with heterosexual cisgender youth. And queer youth were more likely to say that violence or abuse made them leave home, as compared to their heterosexual cisgender counterparts. And so what happens when queer youth leave home, they might go and try to access a shelter. And often what I've been hearing is folks from outside of HRM are being told go to HRM because HRM has more queer people. But the reality is that we have issues with rejection from men's and women's shelters for folks who are non-binary or who don't present in a binary gender. And so there's this element of rejection. You think about a youth reaching out for support and then being rejected. It causes this pattern of not believing, and for good reason, that these systems are actually available or for them. And so there is some evidence of youth engaging in survival sex work to couch surf and otherwise. And so unhoused queer and trans people are disproportionately disabled, and they're disproportionately Indigenous, Black, and POC. So we talked a little bit about neoliberalism in the first presentation, if you were able to catch it, but I'll just go over some pieces around neoliberalism. So it's a political and economic philosophy that espouses individual responsibility, privatization, and free markets. And as a result, poverty has become increasingly individualized and downloaded onto poor individuals. And so we hear a lot about pulling yourself up from your bootstraps. Um, but as we saw in that first presentation, I'm going to be thinking about that for a long time. It's just that the problems that we're having are actually not individual problems, they're systemic problems. And so when we think about worthiness, under neoliberalism, your individual worth is marked by your consumption and your production. So your ability to consume or to purchase, and your ability to produce. And so those elements can become quite problematic. And so when we think about what defines worthiness, there's a lot of conversations on the housing crisis in Canada naming international students and migrants as the problem. And I think that it's a really interesting convergence of both racism and xenophobia, and also an ignorance to the ways in which international students and migrants have been exploited by the Canadian government. And so when we think about these scapegoats, I came across this piece by AJ Withers in the book Fight to Win Inside Poor People's Organizing, which looks at the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty in Toronto. And so AJ Withers describes this moral economy, which is an idea that describes a theory of value that is imposed by others, both structurally and interpersonally, to measure human worth. And then it also lets us examine this differentiation attributed to racialized and Indigenous peoples. And so the social relations of neoliberalism demand that people participate in the capitalist labor market in order to live. And those who do not work are constructed into two groups: deserving and undeserving, or worthy and unworthy poor. And that I'm going to talk a little bit about this dichotomy of worthy and unworthy poor. But I think what is most important here is when we have this system of neoliberalism, it displaces social reproduction, which is the making and maintenance of life and social relations, including health, education, and culture. And so we talked a little bit about, in the first presentation, talking about how there was this shift in the 90s. The National Housing Program was ended in 93. Some provinces took up the slack and some didn't, right? And so there's been a longstanding history of austerity measures, which have included the erosion of social assistance and social housing that have brought us to this moment. And so that's kind of the context. And so when we think about housing support, and we think about the origins of housing support, we have to go back about 400 years or so. And that's, I'm sure we could go back even further than that, of course, settler colonialism, but I want to touch on this specific piece around the Elizabethan Poor Laws, which were the amalgamation of various criminal and legislative measures against the poor that were developed in the 1500s and inherited from the British Crown. And they're the collection of various poor taxes from property owners that were given primarily to churches and to some charitable organizations to distribute relief, and permitted the development of poor houses and workhouses as a form of indoor relief. And they also gave a wide breadth of authority to dole out punishment based on Catholic views of morality and dignity. The paupers included orphan children, the elderly, and the disabled who were put to work. And so when we think about gender segregated shelter services run by historically oppressive institutions, I do want to name the Salvation Army in the sense that this is a really nuanced conversation, because the Salvation Army also provides services in an under-resourced and underserviced area. However, the Salvation Army also donates a lot of its funds in that Christmas kind of ringing the bell moment to anti-queer or anti-trans and homophobic movements. And so when we think about the Salvation Army as a gender segregated shelter, but also as an oppressive institution against queer people, there are elements where that lineage of, okay, there was money that was given, and there's this morality that actually excludes a certain group of people, and that group of people being queer and trans folks. And so, in terms of poorhouses, Halifax had its own. And so, on the left, you'll see the remnants of the poorhouse that sat on Robie and South Street after the fire on November 6th, 1882. This is now where the IWK is. And so you can see, obviously, there was quite a bit of damage. And so on the night of November 6th, 1882, the poorhouse was burnt to a shell, and more lives were lost in that blaze than in any other fire in the city's history. The fire, which started accidentally in the kitchen area of the building, was discovered at about 11:30. It spread quickly through the ceiling to the walls and the elevator, and then from the elevator shaft to the rest of the massive fortress-like structure. Unfortunately, the watchmen, firemen, and nurses were of little assistance since they were all inmates, which is what they called the folks who lived at the poorhouse, who were paid a couple of dollars a month to perform their duties. But because they had been incarcerated, they were in a space where they were like scarcely reliable, unfortunately. Many of the 343 inmates were hysterical when city firemen arrived, and when the main door was felled with a fireman's axe, pandemonium erupted. A crowd of inmates streamed outdoors, and this included mothers nursing infants, some 50 to 60 children, elderly women, and elderly men. Some were partially clothed and others wrapped in blankets. The fire killed 31 people and was quite gruesome because many of the folks who lived there were confined to their beds. So many of the folks who died were disabled. And at the end of it, no one was held liable for their deaths. And so this kind of this ethic around what it means to support the poor, what it means to criminalize the poor, is something that has followed us to this day. And so just a little while later, they erected a poorhouse on the same site in 1886, and then it was demolished in 1976. Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit towards intersectional justice, because I think that when we talk about what it means to attend to a housing crisis, we need to think about what is justice. And so when I was looking for inspiration for this presentation, I went immediately to Audre Lorde, because I believe that Audre Lorde's work is really foundational to when we think about justice. And so she said in her essay, Learning from the 60s, in 1982, she said, "There's no such thing as single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And survival is not a theory. In what way do I contribute to the subjugation of any part of those who I define as my people?" And so I want folks to think about, as we move through the rest of this presentation, what are the ways that you contribute to the subjugation of any part of those who you define as your people? And so that can be homophobic or transphobic attitudes. That can look like bullying yourself. And that can also look like poor blaming and poor shaming, and the ways in which we engage in those narratives. And what are the ways that we can resist those narratives? I wanted to talk a little bit about Kathy Crow. So Kathy Crow, she called herself a street nurse. She worked in Toronto in the early 80s. And she wrote she's written a few books, but she wrote one book called A Knapsack Full of Dreams, Memoirs of a Street Nurse. And so the work that she did as a street nurse was by physically attending to folks who were on the street. And she talked a lot in her memoir about how the conditions that she treated were conditions that we didn't really hear about very much outside of war. And so she talked about tuberculosis. She talked about flesh-eating disease. I know that we had another uptick in flesh-eating disease maybe a year ago, but these are things that have been happening on the streets in the city for a very long time. And so the work that she's done has been, as a nurse, to politicize her work. And so she said this in an article for Toronto Star. She said, "Concerns about conditions in the city's shelter system are decades old. If the pandemic taught us anything, it should be that the days of warehousing 30 to 100 people in common areas common sleeping areas on cots or bunk beds, some with disabilities and walkers, or relying on the faith community for over 30 years to shelter people on an auditorium floors is barbaric. And if you want to read the article is Olivia Chow should lead a disaster tour of community housing and shelters. And so obviously, like, this is a different context than where we are in Chibuktuk. In Toronto, they have 6 million people. But we know that there are more people coming to Chibuktuk. We know that there are more people who are living in Mi'kmaq. And so we are kind of at the beginning of a crisis that is worsening. And there was some talk about pallet shelters at the forum. And that kind of, to me, sounds a lot like warehousing 30 to 100 people in a common sleeping area. And again, this is not a solution to the crisis. We have to look further, and we have to look intersectionally about the ways in which we are supporting people. I know some of the folks on here are not social workers, but I do want to touch on the Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization Decision Assistance tool. And so for folks who are unfamiliar, in the assessment of a person for services, for housing, we are supposed to assess folks using standardized decision-making tools. And so this is from specifically the Reaching Home federal program, which designates the rules in which we have to follow as housing support workers. And so it says this, it says communities are responsible for selecting the assessment tool that works best for them based on local needs and priorities, as well as their approach to coordinated access. Any tool used for coordinated access should have, to the greatest extent possible, the following qualities. And so these are the qualities that it needs. It needs to be tested, valid, and appropriate. It needs to be reliable. It needs to be person-centered, which focuses on resolving the person's needs instead of filling a project vacancy. It needs to be user-friendly. It needs to be strengths-based, which focuses on the person's barriers to and strengths for obtaining sustainable housing. It needs to be housing first oriented, focused on rapidly housing participants without preconditions. It needs to be sensitive to lived experiences. And it needs to focus on reducing trauma and harm. And it needs to be transparent in the relationship between questions being asked and the potential options for housing and support services. And so when we think about all of those qualities, I want to draw our attention to the VI SPDAT. And so the VI SPDAT is something that when I came into this role, I was really frustrated with, and I still am, because I believe that the VI SPDAT is actually supporting the continued discrimination of Black and Brown and youth service users. And this is evidenced also by literature. And so there's been a couple different studies on the VI SPDAT. And so both Black women and white women reported similarly high odds of homelessness due to trauma, but white women consistently scored higher on the VI SPDAT. And closer inspection revealed that white women reported more visits to the emergency rooms and formal healthcare use compared to Black women. They were also more likely to report engaging in risky behaviors like survival sex. And it is possible that Black women are disproportionately at risk for trauma on the street, but are scoring lower on the VI SPDAT because they are less likely to use formal healthcare and reluctant to report illicit behavior. And so not only does the VI SPDAT hold a racial bias, but it also holds a gender bias. And so when we think about the way that the VI SPDAT is being used as a tool to measure acuity, I have to wonder if it's actually doing what we want it to. And so there was another article that I looked into talking about invisible intersectionality in the VI SPDAT. And the way that it is being used is that if I upload somebody's name to the by name list and I don't upload a VI SPDAT, then that person is not going to show up when people pull for their programs, when there is a bed that is available. But the reality is that the VI SPDAT is a highly traumatizing and dehumanizing process. And it's non-therapeutically relevant to the engagement of someone into services. And so why do people have to disclose their deepest traumas to get housing? And it's for that reason that I believe that we need to turn towards a needs-based approach, and why I have not used the VI SPDAT. in any engagement that I've used with youth, because I believe that is an unethical engagement. And so I'm calling upon the social workers in this call specifically and housing workers to boycott the VI SPDAT and to talk amongst their staff about why do we use this this assessment tool when it has evidence of racial bias, and it is also re-traumatizing, and it's not following the demands of the Reaching Home project. Okay, so I'm gonna transition here into talking a little bit about my experience working with queer and trans youth. And so for some folks, this is not going to be news, but for others, maybe it is. And so I hope that you can take something away from this. So when we think about transphobia, I think about the exclusion and the dehumanization of trans people. And so when I work with youth, I hear a lot about experiences at shelters mirroring the experiences that they had in school or in public space. And so to the right, you'll see a poster that looks at LGBTQ2S barriers to employment and training that was created by Dr. Alex Abramovich. And so in that poster, they talk a little bit about barriers to employment. And so I've had conversations with youth who have said, I really want to get a job, but I just don't want to be harassed every day. Can I get a job that I'm not public facing so I don't have to deal with the harassment of like just being there and having to work and also having to weather this storm, right? And then having management dismiss, you need to be nice. It's a retail space. You need to be nice. And so they're really shouldering this load by themselves. When we think about gender segregated services, those can also be a barrier to folks, right? So we'll have folks who, like I've worked with some trans masculine people who've said, I don't feel safe in the men's shelter, but I also don't feel safe in the women's shelter. And so when they age out of youth services, which are usually like co-ed services, then what happens, right? Like, where do they go? And so there are also competing access needs here too, right? Like there are some service users who they need to have gender segregated spaces. And that's something that needs to be supported as well. But the solutions to this problem, I think, are actually a lot more closer together than we think, but are still obviously a huge issue. I talked a little bit about some structural barriers, like the VI SPDAT is a structural barrier. But when we think about actually getting to a shelter, there's forms where people have to give their legal name, right? And they have to disclose their trans status to obtain specialized services or specialized supports. And so there are elements where there are transphobic and homophobic staff members and a lack of policy that protects queer and trans youth specifically, that leaves them especially vulnerable. And so do youth have to out themselves in order to receive gender affirming care? I think that it could be a lot better. And is also a real problem when it comes to actually creating services that are affirming and are supportive for queer and trans folks. I've heard a lot from youth specifically about the role of peers as buffers to harm from other service users and staff, and the ways that youth will often form these bonds and these connections in order to keep each other safe. And I think that that's something that needs to be championed and also needs to be taken into account. And so how do we operate from a strengths-based perspective where I'm saying to youth, if I'm doing a housing intake, I say, do you have anybody who you want to come with you when we have this conversation? Is there anybody who you want me to talk to about what's going on with you? Is there anybody that you don't want me to talk to? And so those are things that from an autonomy and person-centered lens, we're looking at ways we can engage folks' support networks in order to get them housed. And then there's a chronic lack of youth-led services in the city. When we think about youth serving organizations, there are histories of youth serving organizations, falling apart. There is also just an under resource of like recreation and third spaces for youth to just hang out. And so those elements are also things that come into play. So the kind of repeating myself a little bit, but There was a report that was commissioned by the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate that found that 44% of gender diverse participants reported having to move out of their house due to problems with the condition of the house. And so bed bugs, lack of heat, mold is a big one. Stairs that are falling apart. Those are things that, like we saw in the first presentation of today, are things that are preventable, are not necessarily problems with housing itself, but are problems with the ways in which we have supported housing in the province. 69% of gender diverse people reported being unable to find or maintain housing due to affordability issues. I would say that I had a conversation with TRIS, which is the Tenants' Rights for International Students group, and they said about 90% of international students, and specifically like gender diverse students, 90% of them were really on the cusp, right, of being able to maintain their housing due to affordability issues. That's not a surprise here. And then 41% reported feeling unsafe in their place or their neighborhood, right? So roommates who are, consistently dead naming their roommates, roommates who are throwing out their gender affirming items, parents who are throwing out gender affirming items, different types of gender-based violence that are happening that are specific to queer and trans people. Those are things that are being reported. And those are things that I'm also hearing about as a housing support worker. On the right, there's a picture of Marsha P. Johnson, and she's holding a sign, and it says, "Star people are beautiful people." And I wanted to recognize the fact that queer and trans people have always showed up for each other because the government consistently has failed us. The government failed us with HIV, the government has failed us in our housing, and our communities have often failed us because they've excluded us. And so the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, the Star House that was built, was put together in New York in the 70s, it was originally a camper trailer where 20 star youth, gender diverse youth, were living. And then they eventually moved into a house in the East Side where folks were able to be taught how to read and write and were able to get their needs met. And I think that, like, when it comes to these pieces, it's that our ancestors have taught us that we can show up for each other. And so when I think about working with queer and trans youth, that's one of the things that keeps me going in the midst of a lot of really dark and devastating grief, is that there have always been people showing up for each other. And so I would love to have a transitional housing program in this city for queer and trans youth. That's my dream. And so if you're somebody who has a lot of money laying around and you want to make that happen, get in touch. And so I'm going to start to close out my presentation. And so I want to encourage folks to think globally and act locally. And so here are some questions that you can ask yourself. So it's, where do you call home? Who named that place? What is the name of the place you were born? And what is it called now? For some people, that may have changed due to colonization. You can also think about, where do your utilities come from or go to? Your water, power, sewage, and waste. Who is involved in that process? Do they make a living wage? And what displacement occurs in the extraction process? You can also think about, who do you pay rent to? Do you participate in reparations to the Indigenous communities you live in or have displaced? And how do you engage in settler responsibility? And the last question here, set of questions, is, who are your neighbors? Do you know their names? What are the ways you ask for help from your neighbors and show care in return? Can you have a conversation with them about mutual aid? And so those are things that, when we think globally, even when we think globally about climate change and the ways in which, we had all these wildfires in the summer, and thinking about a right to clean air and a right to a safe place, right? Like, those are things that we need to think about when we look at solutions to the housing crisis. We need to also look at who has a right to accessing safety. I'm going to end my part of the presentation by reading a post that I saw on Instagram that I think is really relevant to us, and that I want to leave as an offering to all of you. So this is from What's One More Pothos is the Instagram account, and they wrote this. The title is "No Masters, No Flakes: A Word on How This Moment Needs All of Us." And there's a note here that says "No Masters, No Flakes" was coined by Mutual Aid Relief. Okay, so it says this: This moment needs you. Yes, you. Your individual wisdom is valuable and needed for our collective liberation. Let's meet at the table with our humble offerings. Here there are no masters, no flakes. Please do not pedestal me or anyone. Instead, I want you to see me. See my grief and rage and fear and sadness and worry. See parts of yourself reflected in me. See us. Trace the threads that bind us. We are interdependent. In the words of the late Gwendolyn Brooks, we are each other's harvest. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond. This moment does not demand perfection nor charisma, nor feelings of hope and positivity, nor promptness. Welcome, glad you are here now. Pull up a chair, there is much to be done. You need not be a scholar nor activist. That is individualism whispering in your ear. This moment demands urgency, intention, commitment, collaboration, and care. Can you give that? Something inside us has been awakened. In the words of Francis Weller, we must sit with what has been stirred. Sit still. Read, watch, listen, learn together. Sit still. Our insides build ballast. Ballast keeps us steady as we act with courage, but we must first sit still. To paraphrase Mariam Kaba, no one gets to opt out of defining what is needed for our collective liberation. See yourself, see me, see all of us as tentacles of the same liberatory project, fighting like hell to get free together. Thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation. If you want to follow the youth project, you can follow us on at NS Youth Project. I haven't been looking at the chat, but I'll catch up here.
So thank you so very much. We are really grateful for your wisdom and really tying in intersectional bias and housing insecurity to the larger colonial project and helping us understand that. There's some great resources that have also been shared in the chat, but please take in some of the love that is being sent your way. So much gratitude. I don't know if anyone has any questions. We are technically out of time, but we did start just a little bit later. So if anyone has any last minute questions, the question that keeps coming up to me is about the recording. This is on our YouTube channel. It takes about a month or so for things to get uploaded and processed and edited and put to our YouTube channel. But hopefully you all are watching that. And Rae, thank you especially for always being such an amazing speaker, incredibly thoughtful, and really helping us integrate this and the reflections on some of the tools that we use and the unique vulnerabilities of marginalized, intersectionally oppressed groups were in that beautiful, powerful reading that you did at the end. Hopefully you're taking all of that gratitude in. So with that, I'm not seeing any other questions, but lots of fabulous discussion and dialogue and resource sharing in the chat. So we are going to take a break.